The air over Harrow Falls arrived before the cold did. It came as a smell first iron and wet stone, the particular metallic sharpness that old-timers called a frost warning. Though most of the men who had built this town were still young enough to believe winter was something you could outwork. The sky had turned the color of a gun barrel sometime in the night, and by morning the peaks to the northwest wore fresh caps of white that hadn't been there the day before. October in Dakota Territory didn't ask permission. It arrived the way all irreversible things do, without announcement, without the courtesy of gradual. Idella Voss had not slept. She sat on the edge of the narrow bed in the room she shared with her mother, the one room they would share for 5 more days before it belonged to someone else, watching the light change through the single window. The glass was old and slightly warped, so the dawn came through it wavering, as if the world outside were liquid. She had her father's journal in her lap. She had not opened it. She was holding it the way you hold something that contains a person you no longer have access to. Not reading, not thinking, simply maintaining contact with the last solid thing. Helen Voss was already awake. She was always already awake now because sleep had become unreliable since the cough moved in and took up residence in her chest, like a tenant who paid no rent and left the place in ruins. She stood at the small stove with her back to Ida, boiling water for the tea she needed every morning to convince her lungs to cooperate with the day. Her shoulders had a particular set to them, not defeated, not yet, but careful. The shoulders of a woman rationing her strength. Edward's work boots stood in the corner where they had stood for 2 years. Helen had never moved them. Moving them had always seemed like a declaration she wasn't ready to make, a sentence spoken aloud that could not be taken back. Ida looked at them each morning the same way, long enough to register, short enough not to linger. Then she looked away. The meeting is at 9. Helen didn't turn around. I know what time the meeting is. We should go early. Helen made a sound that wasn't quite a laugh. There are no good seats in that room, Ida. She wasn't wrong. The Harrow Falls Town Hall was a single room that smelled of pine sawdust and the ghosts of 100 arguments conducted in tobacco smoke. The benches were raw wood, green enough to have warped over summer, the space between them so narrow that a grown man had to turn sideways to pass. It was not a room designed for comfort. It was a room designed for transactions, the kind conducted between people who held power and people who needed something from it. They walked the 4 blocks through streets still mostly quiet. The lumber mill at the eastern edge of town had not yet started its morning scream. A few horses stood at hitching posts outside the saloon, heads down, patient as old men. The new assayer's office had fresh paint on its sign, the letters crisp in the gray morning light. J. Clyde Holt, Territorial Certified Assayer. The name Holt was not a coincidence. In Harrow Falls, it never was. The town hall door was already open. Inside, 4 men sat behind the long table at the front, members of the council, men who own things. Judge Cyrus Holt occupied the center chair. He was a large man with a softness at his middle that contradicted the hardness of everything else about him. His watch chain caught the pale light from the window each time he shifted, a small gold reminder of the distance between his side of the table and theirs. Ida noticed Clem Dacre before she noticed anything else in the room, because Clem Dacre was not supposed to be there. He occupied the far end of the last bench, tucked against the wall where the shadow ran thickest. His wide-brimmed hat was pulled low enough to cover most of his face, showing only the jaw, a jaw she knew belonged to a man who had worked the Harrow copper mines for 30 years before his knees forced his retirement. A bottle of whiskey, less than a quarter full, sat beside his boot like a small, loyal dog. His chest rose and fell in the slow rhythm of sleep, but he was not asleep. Ida had known enough miners to understand the difference between a man sleeping and a man performing sleep. The stillness was slightly too controlled. She filed this away and took her place beside her mother. Judge Holt cleared his throat. The sound filled the room the way water fills a jar, completely leaving no space for anything else. Helen. Not Mrs. Voss, not the widow Voss, just Helen, the deliberate use of a first name stripped of its title, its protection, its inherited right to be addressed as someone whose husband had mattered. The board has reviewed your situation. With winter coming and your current lack of means, we cannot have you continuing to occupy the cabin on town charter land. It's needed for the new assayer. At the back of the room, at the very edge of the shadows where the window's light didn't quite reach, a young man with clean hands and a new coat shifted his weight almost imperceptibly. His eyes moved to the judge, then away. He had the look of someone waiting for something to be confirmed. Helen's voice came out small and careful. "Where will we go?" Holt gestured towards the map pinned to the wall behind him, the gesture of a man who had performed it many times for many different recipients of many different forms of unfortunate news. "We are not without charity. The board has deeded you a plot. 3 acres at the edge of the territory line. It is yours, free and clear." He said it with the warmth of a man presenting a gift, and the 4 other men at the table arranged their faces into expressions of solemn generosity. Ida looked at the map. She knew the plot. Every person in the valley who had been in Harrow Falls more than one winter knew it. The scarp, a north-facing slope of loose rock and stunted juniper, so steep that nothing useful grew there. Nothing sensible could be built. No timber, no pasture, no water, except the violent snowmelt that carved new gullies through the shale every spring. Its one distinguishing feature was a dark gash in the rock face near the top, perhaps 10 feet wide, that local children had named the Cold Mouth because of the icy air that sighed from it in summer. Because going inside it, even on a July afternoon, felt like pressing your face against something that had never in its entire existence been warm. The board had given them a place to die. They had dressed it in the language of charity, tied it with the ribbon of a legal deed, passed it across the table with the expressions of men who expected gratitude. Ida stepped forward. The movement was slight, barely a shift of weight, barely a change in the geometry of the room, but it altered something. She took the deed from Holt's outstretched hand. Her calloused fingers did not linger on his soft ones. She looked at the map, at the small square of useless land that was now theirs, and understood exactly what had been handed to her. "We thank you," she said, "because it cost nothing." Closed the conversation, then walked her mother out into the gray October morning. She had almost cleared the threshold when she heard it. 5 words muttered low, aimed precisely the kind of words spoken by a man who has calculated the exact volume required to reach one set of ears and no others. "Your father knew that place." "Who that?" Ida's hand found the door frame. She turned. Clem Dacre's hat was back down over his face, his chest rising and falling in the slow performance of unconsciousness. By the time she drew her next breath, he was already moving, a large shadow detaching from the back of the room, slipping through a side door she hadn't registered as existing. She stood with the deed in one hand and a question that had no answer yet. Outside, Owen Mercer was waiting. He stood against the porch post of his father's general store across the street, arms folded over his chest, watching the town hall door with the kind of attention that tries to disguise itself as indifference. He was 19 tall through the body, but not yet grown into his own height, his face occupying the uncertain middle ground between the boy he'd been and the man he was still deciding whether to become. His eyes had a quality of calculation that he mistook for intelligence, that other people mostly found unsettling. He called her name, not her full name, but the shortened one, the one only her father had used, the one she hadn't heard since the funeral, hadn't expected to hear from this particular mouth. The muscles along her jaw tightened without any decision on her part. He pushed off the post as they passed. "I heard about the council's decision." A practiced casualness in the voice, the casualness of someone who had thought carefully about how to open this conversation. "Listen, my father has a room behind the store. Nothing fancy, but it's warm and dry. You could stay there, work the counter a few hours a day to cover the cost. It's a fair deal." He said it with an easy smile, but his eyes were tracking something beyond her face, reading the air around her for signals. The offer was real. Ida understood that. Owen Mercer was not a cruel person. He was something more complicated than cruel, which made him in some ways more difficult to navigate. He was a person who measured his worth entirely by how much other people required him. His mother had died when he was 9, lung sickness, the same rattling cough that had taken up residence in Helen's chest. His father had taught him the lesson frontier towns tend to teach: you are either useful or you are invisible. Owen had spent a decade trying to be useful. Ida said no. She didn't explain. She didn't soften it with apology or complicate it with gratitude. She closed the door on the offer the way you close a door, not with anger, simply with finality. Owen's smile held its shape, but something shifted behind it. "Pride doesn't keep you warm," he said to her back. She kept walking. Helen's hand found her daughter's arm. They walked in silence up the road that climbed out of the valley, the town falling away behind them. In Ida's mind, without her permission, without her cooperation, memory pulled her backward through time. She was 14. Her father's hand was in hers, leading her down into the Harrow copper mine for the first time. The shaft descended at a steep angle, timbered with lodgepole beams that groaned under the pressure of the mountain above. The air changed as they went deeper, and this was the thing she hadn't expected. It grew warmer. At 200 feet, Edward Voss stopped. He turned off his lamp. The darkness was not an absence of light. It was a presence, something with mass that pressed against her eyes as if it had weight. She felt her own heartbeat in her throat. "Don't be afraid." His voice carried the Pennsylvania coal country in it, the particular flat vowels and careful consonants of men who had grown up understanding that the earth had moods, that learning to read them was a matter of survival. "Just listen." She listened, not with her ears because there was nothing to hear. She listened with her skin, the deeper layer, the one that registered temperature not as sensation, but as information. Slowly she felt it. Warmth. Not the warmth of a fire or another body, but something foundational, heat that had been accumulating for longer than human memory, stored in rock that predated every living thing. The walls of the shaft radiated it with the slow generosity of a substance that has been holding something in trust and is now gently releasing it. Edward lit the lamp. His eyes were bright, the way they got when he was about to show her something he'd been keeping. "The surface lies, Ida. Down here, the earth tells the same story all year." He pressed his hand flat against the rock face. "Constancy. That's what lives down here. The earth's memory of warmth." He paused, his expression turning inward the way it did when he was working through something he wasn't ready to speak aloud. "That land north of town, the hillside with the cave. Everyone says it's worthless." A small private smile. "But I see something they—" A shout from deeper in the shaft. A timber brace, a near miss, the kind of small crisis that doesn't wait for convenient moments. Edward turned toward the sound, already moving, and the sentence ended the way too many things ended, with her father in the middle before the point. 3 months later, the shaft collapsed. Now walking the road to the scarp with her mother's arm in hers, Ida understood what she hadn't understood at 14. Her father's unfinished sentence had an ending. He had seen something at that hillside, not vague potential, but specific potential, the kind that required a particular literacy to recognize. The deed was not a random cruelty. It was an inheritance delivered by the wrong hands for the wrong reasons, landing on the right person 2 years too late. The approach took 40 minutes on a good day. This was not a good day. The road was rutted from the previous week's rain, Helen needing to stop twice, each pause marked by the cough that had made itself so thoroughly at home in her chest. Ida steadied her mother on the loose gravel and said nothing, because nothing useful could be said. The land was worse than she remembered, the slope carpeted in sharp, loose rock that shifted under every footfall, wind running across it without obstruction, carrying a temperature several degrees below what it was in the valley. The stunted junipers growing between the rocks had been shaped by decades of that wind into something that looked less like trees and more like things trying very hard to leave. The cold mouth waited at the top with its curtain of thorny bramble, dark and patient. Ida pushed through and stepped inside. The shift was immediate. Wind cut off completely. The air held still, carrying a dampness that held within it the smell of deep stone, not the mineral sharpness of a quarry, but something older, more patient. The smell of rock that had been in contact with darkness for a very long time. She wet her finger and held it up. A faint current of air moved across her skin, flowing from the interior toward the entrance. The cave was exhaling natural ventilation driven by the temperature difference between the still air inside and the cooling air without. Her father's words surfaced whole from memory. "The mountain breathes." She sat at the entrance and opened the journal. Edward Voss's handwriting was precise, angular, the script of a man who had learned to write in one-room schoolhouses and made the letters deliberate ever after. The diagrams were meticulous cross-sections of geological formations, timbering configurations, ventilation shaft schematics. He had been, she thought, a poet of physics, a man who experienced the world in terms of forces and resistances, the slow drama of heat moving through solid material. She found the page, a diagram of a horizontal passage driven into a hillside with annotations in his small, careful hand. Beside it, the mountain breathes. In summer, the cool, dense air inside flows out a gift to the hot day. In winter, the warmer, lighter air wants to rise, but a long, gentle slope holds it. The stone is a miser. It holds every degree of warmth it has ever been given. A fire at the mouth is waste. A fire deep inside with a long passage for the heat to travel teaches the warmth a lesson in patience. She read it twice. Then she looked at the cave with different eyes. The plan assembled itself not gradually, but all at once. The way certain kinds of understanding arrive, less like building and more like recognition, as if the answer had always been present in the materials, waiting for the right person to align herself correctly. They would seal the entrance with a wall of wood, framing a door and a single small window. The heating system would not be a fireplace. It would be a trench 40 feet long, running from a firebox positioned well inside the cave, beneath the floor terminating at a chimney stack positioned far from the entrance. The trench would be lined with flat stones and sealed with clay. Hot gases from the fire would travel the full 40 feet underground, surrendering their heat to the rock, which would surrender it upward through the floor, a radiator of slow, steady warmth. What emerged from the distant chimney would be cool and spent nearly invisible, having paid its thermal debt in full. It was the thinking of a miner, not a carpenter. It had been born below ground. On the rock outside the entrance, when Ida emerged, she found things that had not been there when she arrived. A set of mining tools arranged neatly on a flat stone, a spare pickaxe, a short-handled shovel, and iron chisel. Old, worn to the shape of use, sharpened with care. She crouched to examine the pickaxe's handle and found what she was looking for before she understood she was looking for it. A particular angle of wear on the blade, evidence of a specific sharpening technique. She had seen that technique once before on the tools her father had kept on hooks in the corner of their kitchen. A method passed between men who had worked the same kind of stone, learned through contact rather than instruction. Someone who had worked beside Edward Voss had been here. Beside the tools drawn in white chalk on the surface of the stone, an arrow pointing into the cave, and beside the arrow, a number. 2 degrees. She looked at it for a long moment, then picked up the pickaxe, tested its weight in both hands, carried it inside. Doc Ira Sutton's office was attached to the back of his house on Meridian Street. Sutton himself was 60 years old, thin, in the way of men who have always considered eating an interruption to more important work. His spectacles sat on the very tip of his nose, perpetually threatening departure. He met Ida on the porch rather than inside, which she understood to mean the news would not be improved by comfortable seating. "Your mother's lungs are badly compromised." His voice was clinical in the way that the kindest doctors learn to be clinical, removing his own emotion from the transaction so that hers could remain intact. "The tissue is scarred. If she spends the winter in cold, damp conditions or in a space filled with smoke, she will not see February. I am telling you a medical fact, not a prognosis. What does she need? Warm air, dry air, clean air. Not warm for an hour, then cold for 3, consistently warm, consistently clean over the entire winter." He removed his spectacles, rubbed the bridge of his nose. "I don't know what your plan is for that hillside, but those are the requirements." He turned to go inside, then stopped with his hand on the door frame, the posture of a man who has decided after a moment's consideration to say one more thing. "Your father came to see me about 2 years before the accident. He wanted to know how mine air affected lung tissue. Specifically, he was researching whether a person could live underground without respiratory damage. He had theories about ventilation, air exchange rates, humidity control. Very precise theories." A pause. "I believe he found his answers. The mind took him before he could use them." He went inside. The door closed. Ida stood on the porch as the afternoon light flattened toward evening, and what settled over her was not comfort, but something more useful. The understanding that what her father had left behind in that journal was not a record of observations. It was a blueprint designed for this, designed for her mother, designed for the specific medical necessity Sutton had just described in the language of lungs and tissue, while Edward Voss had written about it in the language of thermal gradients and airflow. Her father had been building something. He just hadn't finished. She had 6 weeks to finish it for him. That evening in the cabin, 5 more days, and it would belong to someone else. She told Helen everything. Her mother listened without interrupting, which was not typical. Helen Voss had opinions and was accustomed to expressing them. The silence was its own kind of statement. When Ida finished, the quiet that followed was not the quiet of consideration. It was the quiet of fear, specific, deep-rooted, earned. "You're talking like your father." The words landed the way blunt objects land. Ida absorbed them without moving. "Your father had ideas about the earth, too." Helen's voice carried a tremor beneath it that had nothing to do with the cough. "Very beautiful ideas. Very precise ideas." She looked at her hands in her lap. "And the earth took him anyway." The voice rose slightly. The rising brought the cough. Always the rising brought the cough, a full minute of it racking that left Helen breathless, in the color of ash. When she could speak again, her eyes were wet. "I would rather die with people around me than alone in a cave." "You won't die. Your father said things like that too." The words hung between them in the candlelight, sharp as broken glass. Neither of them spoke for a long time. Ida looked at her mother's face, the architecture of it, the way fear had replaced the hope Helen had carried into this day, and understood something she couldn't have articulated before this moment. The conversation was not about engineering. It had never been about engineering. It was about whether the voice of a dead man could still be trusted to keep the living alive. Helen straightened in her chair. Something resolved in her expression, not confidence, not peace, but the particular quality of a woman who has reached the bottom of her options and found at the bottom a decision rather than despair. "Give me until the middle of November. If the cave is not livable by then, truly livable, warm and safe, we go back to town. We accept whatever help is offered." A pause. "Even the Mercer boy?" Ida opened her mouth, closed it. "Mid-November," she agreed. That night she lay awake in the dark, and for the first time since the plan had arrived fully formed in the cold mouth, she let the doubt in. Not speculation, genuine doubt, the architectural kind, the kind that finds the joints and asks whether they'll hold. What if her reading of the journal was wrong? What if the thermal properties of that specific rock were not what her father had cataloged? What if 40 feet of trench was simply not enough? What if she was a 17-year-old girl with a dead man's pickaxe and a theory inherited from a man whose theories had not ultimately saved him? She reached for the journal without lighting a candle, opened it near the back to a page she knew where the ink had run, where something wet had fallen on it during some long-ago night, blurring the words. She couldn't read it in this darkness. She didn't try. She pressed her hand flat against the page, feeling the slight texture where the ink had dried in ridges, the places where her father's pen had pressed hardest, and did the only thing available to her. She chose to believe. The morning they left the cabin arrived without ceremony. They loaded their few possessions onto a handcart, bedrolls, the crate of potatoes and dried beans. Helen's quilts, the collection of Edward's rock samples that Helen had kept, because she could not bring herself to dispossess a dead man of his only hobby. Helen paused in the doorway for a long moment, looking back into the room. Edward's work boots stood in the corner where they had always stood. Ida didn't look back. She was already measuring the angle of the slope in her head. They passed the general store. Owen Mercer was on the porch. Of course, he was arms folded, watching. He had arranged his face into what he believed was an expression of sympathy, but the satisfaction lived around the edges of it. The satisfaction of a man who has predicted disaster and is beginning to believe he'll be proven right. "When you can't take it anymore," he called out, pitched just loud enough, "the store is always open." Helen's grip on Ida's arm tightened. They kept walking. The road climbed out of the valley through stands of lodgepole pine. Helen coughed on the steeper sections. Ida held her arm and said nothing. Above them, the gray sky held its promises of coming snow in reserve. The scarp opened before them, the loose rock, the wind, the stunted junipers trying to leave. The cold mouth waited at the top with its curtain of thorny bramble, dark and patient. The tools were still there on the flat rock. Ida set down her end of the handcart, walked to the pickaxe, lifted it, tested the weight through both wrists. The chalk mark was still clear on the stone. 2 degrees, an arrow and a number and no explanation. She filed it into the back of her mind, where it would wait until she had the context to understand it. Helen had begun to hum. It was a simple melody, a half-remembered tune from childhood, the kind of song that has no real origin story, worn smooth by the passing of many hands. She hummed it while she unpacked the handcart, while she carried the bedrolls through the brambles and into the dark mouth of the cave, while she set the crate of potatoes against the stone wall. She stood for a moment in the dim stillness of what was now their home, looking at the cave that everyone in Harrow Falls had agreed was a place to die. The humming continued quiet as breath steady as conviction. Ida positioned herself at the point where the trench would begin approximately 8 feet inside the entrance where she would build the firebox. Before her lay 40 feet of packed earth. She gripped the pickaxe in both hands, raised it over her right shoulder, swung it into the floor. The impact rang through her arms like a struck bell, the vibration running from wrists to elbows to shoulders. In one sharp communication, I am not interested in being moved. She pulled the pick free, reset her grip, swung again. The first inch of earth took 20 minutes. She had begun, and she understood in the ringing of that handle against her palms that she was not entirely alone in a way she hadn't been able to name until this exact moment when the weight of the tool carried within it the history of someone else's use, someone who had known her father well enough to sharpen a blade the way he sharpened his. She didn't know who, not yet. That understanding would come the way all the important understandings seemed to come in the story she was now living, not when she reached for it, but when she had done enough work to deserve it. The earth did not want to be moved. That was the first lesson and the beginning of everything. The glacial till beneath the cold mouth had not been disturbed in 10,000 years, and it intended to keep that record intact. Ida learned this the way all foundational lessons get learned, not through instruction, but through consequence, through the specific education that only comes when your body is the instrument of measurement. The floor of the cave was not soil in any agricultural sense. It was compressed history, layers of clay and shattered rock fused together under the weight of ice that had retreated before human memory began. Each swing of the pickaxe sent a shock wave up through the handle, through her wrists, into the joints of her elbows, arriving finally at her shoulders as a dull declaration of resistance. Every shovelful of debris weighed more than physics seemed to justify. She developed a rhythm by the third day, not because the work became easier, but because her body stopped negotiating with it. She rose when the gray pre-dawn light turned the entrance from black to charcoal. She worked until the darkness made the trench indistinguishable from the cave floor around it. 12 hours, sometimes 14. She stopped measuring time by the clock and started measuring it by body lengths, the length of her own frame, serving as the unit of progress. One full Ida length of trench per day when the earth was cooperative. Half that when the pickaxe rang against embedded granite with a sound like a door slamming shut. Helen worked beside her when the cough permitted, which was less each morning. She mixed clay and water into the thick paste that would seal the stones of the flue, her thin arms trembling with the effort of stirring a substance that had the consistency and weight of wet concrete. When her arms gave out, she gathered flat stones from the scree outside, moving slowly across the loose rock with the careful deliberateness of a woman who could not afford to fall. She selected each stone by hand-weight flatness, the particular way its edges related to the edges of its neighbors, and rejected any that wouldn't sit flush. It was painstaking work that left no visible monument. Without it, nothing would stand. On the morning of the fourth day, Ida arrived at the trench before dawn, lifted the pickaxe from where she'd leaned it against the wall, positioned herself at the leading edge of the excavation, and found 2 additional feet of fresh dug earth that hadn't been there when she'd set the tool down by last light. She crouched at the edge of the new section. The work was careful, competent, done by someone who understood how to read compacted earth, where to set the point of the pick for maximum effect, how to use the natural fault lines in the till rather than fighting them. The distinctive angle of the pickaxe marks was familiar in a way she couldn't immediately locate. She stood, looked at the cave entrance. Nothing moved in the pre-dawn gray outside. She picked up the tool where the unknown hand had left it, settled into the stance, continued from where the other person had stopped. This happened 4 more times over the following 2 weeks, always in the hours before she woke. Always exactly 2 additional feet, never more. Never a note, never any indication of who had come in darkness to contribute their labor without being asked or thanked. The progress it created was the difference between possible and impossible. The math of the project, which had always been brutal, shifted incrementally towards something that could be completed before Helen's deadline. Ida didn't mention it to her mother. She understood without needing to reason through it that acknowledging the help would require identifying the helper, which would require a confrontation she wasn't ready for. The work was being done. That was the truth that mattered. On the afternoon of the ninth day, her pickaxe broke through a layer of compacted gravel, and the sound changed. The shift was unmistakable from the dull, thudding percussion of clay-bound earth to something cleaner, almost resonant, like the difference between striking wood and striking stone of a particular density. She dropped to her knees in the narrow trench and cleared the debris with her hands until the surface was exposed. Red sandstone layered with dark veins of shale, the two materials alternating in thin, precise bands. She had seen this exact composition before on the shelf, where her father kept his labeled specimens, the small collection he had accumulated over years of reading the rock around Harrow Falls, the way other men read newspapers. The label on that specimen in Edward Voss's careful print, sandstone/shale composite. Thermal retention excellent. Slow conductivity. Ideal for sustained heating systems. She sat back on her heels with a piece of sandstone in her palm, and the weight of it was not just physical. Her father had not merely known about this hillside in the vague way a miner knows the geology of his territory. He had prospected it, had taken samples, analyzed their properties, cataloged their suitability for a specific application. This application, this trench, this system she was now building according to specifications he had written down years before she understood what she was reading. The scarp was not worthless land. It was land whose value required a particular kind of literacy to perceive, and the men who had handed it over as a death sentence had simply lacked the vocabulary. She set the stone carefully beside the trench, picked up the pickaxe, returned to work. Judge Cyrus Holt arrived on the fifth morning riding his bay gelding up the slope with the careful authority of a man who owns the ground his horse walks on. He sat in the saddle for a long moment, looking at the scene below him with an expression that couldn't settle on a single interpretation. The cave mouth still open, the trench running from it like a surgical incision 40 feet planned, with only 15 currently excavated, the spoil piles rising on either side. Ida's arms moving with the mechanical efficiency of someone who has stopped performing labor and become it. "What in God's name are you building, girl?" She looked up. The angle of the morning sun put him in silhouette, the light around him forming the unintentional halo of a man who believes his own benevolence. "Our hearth." He stared at the trench for several seconds. "You're digging a ditch." "Yes." The leather of his saddle creaked as he shifted weight. He told her about the board's retained rights, the clause about hazardous structures, fire risk, collapse risk, anything that might constitute danger to public safety. His voice had the tone of a man discharging a duty he finds distasteful but necessary. She told him she understood. He waited for explanation, perhaps, or the particular gratitude of someone who recognizes that a powerful man has troubled himself to ride uphill on her behalf. When nothing more came, he turned his horse toward town. The story he carried back traveled the length of Harrow Falls before noon. The Voss widow's daughter was digging a 40-foot ditch in front of a cave and lining it with stones, claiming it was a hearth. The whispers gathered momentum as whispers do when they find willing carriers acquiring embellishment, losing precision, arriving at their various destinations as something between farce and cautionary tale. Someone called it Voss folly, pleased with the sound of it. Others used a single syllable that carried in it the implication of animals in the dark. They said the girl had lost her reason to grief. They said the winter would settle the question soon enough. Ida heard none of it. She was in the trench. Bess Aldrich came to the creek below the scarp on a Tuesday afternoon, standing on the opposite bank with a cloth bundle and the expression of a woman who has made a decision she knows could be argued against. She was 35 with a kind face that broadcast whatever she was feeling, which in a town that valued stoicism had always been a slight disadvantage. She thrust the bundle across the distance between them without preamble: wool yarn, a tin of lard, half a loaf from that morning's baking. "Thomas doesn't know I'm here. He would be angry." Ida's first instinct was refusal clean absolute. She had built the wall of self-reliance around herself and her mother, the way she was building the wall across the cave entrance stone by stone with intention, because it was load-bearing. Taking charity felt like removing one of those stones. Then she thought of Helen's shawl worn thin at the shoulder where the mending could no longer keep up with the wear. She took the bundle. "Thank you." Bess's face relaxed into something that had been waiting for permission to exist. "I watch you from my kitchen window every morning." A brief pause, something working in her expression. "I've never seen anyone work like that. Not even the men in the mine." She left quickly, a woman returning to the approved world before it noticed her absence. Ida stood at the creek bank, holding the bundle, and something shifted in the locked place she'd been carrying since her father's funeral. Not breaking open, nothing so dramatic. Moving the way a door moves when the latch is old, and the house has settled quietly, almost accidentally, just enough to admit a fraction more light. Frank Aldrich came on the seventh day with a mule-drawn cart loaded with Douglas fir. The lumber was good straight grain seasoned for a year, the kind of material that represents real investment in both cost and time. He walked beside the cart rather than riding, which Ida recognized as a gesture, a man arriving as a peer rather than on horseback as an authority. He was 52, built with the solidity of someone who had spent 3 decades doing physical work that mattered. He found her setting capstones on the first completed section of the flue with the precision of someone assembling a mechanism, not just a channel. She was covered in clay from knuckle to shoulder. Frank removed his hat. His voice had the particular gentleness of a man who believes he is about to prevent a catastrophe and is uncomfortable with how much it will require him to say. He described the lean-to he intended to build south-facing against the rock wall, a proper stone and mortar fireplace, warm, dry, structurally sound. Then he told her about 1879, the family in the next valley, 3 of them, a shallow cave, a fire inside, no understanding of what the smoke would do when it had nowhere to go. He had been the one called to retrieve the bodies in the morning. The child was 6 years old, the same age as his daughter Lucy. His voice dropped into a different register when he said it, not the register of professional authority, but of something carried a long time in a space that didn't have a name. Ida listened to every word. She didn't dismiss his experience or his grief. Then she knelt beside the completed section of the flue, struck a match, lit a handful of dried juniper needles she kept for testing, placed them in the firebox at the near end. The smoke did not rise. It did not billow into the cave. It was drawn downward into the stone-lined trench, pulled inward, with the deep, even breath of a system finding its equilibrium. The unmistakable signature of a pressure differential doing exactly what physics predicted it would do. Both of them watched the smoke disappear into the earth. Frank's jaw tightened. "That's just wind." The temperature difference between the air in the flue and the air at the chimney end creates a draw. 40 feet of horizontal passage gives that draw more pull than any vertical chimney you've ever built, because the differential accumulates over the full length rather than dissipating at the opening. She met his eyes. "Your fireplaces lose 90% of their heat up the flue. They pull cold air in through every gap to replace the warm air they push out. You're not heating homes, Frank. You've been heating the sky." He looked for doubt in her face. It was a thorough search, and it found nothing. "That's poetry, not physics." "My father spent 11 years reading this rock." She held his gaze. "I'm reading his notes." The silence between them had the quality of 2 people standing on opposite sides of a canyon, each certain the ground beneath their own feet is solid. Frank replaced his hat. He said he would leave the lumber, his voice carrying the gravity of a man saying something he believes will serve as a eulogy. He walked back toward town with his shoulders set in the posture of a craftsman who has done his due diligence. Ida looked at the stack of Douglas fir and understood without any satisfaction that she would use every board of it not for the lean-to he'd imagined, but to seal the cave entrance he'd believed would kill them. 3 weeks into the excavation, 35 feet of the flue were complete, line capped, sealed with sandstone and shale, packed tight with clay, dried to the hardness of old mortar. The chimney stack at the far end was 3 feet of careful stonework, each joint sealed with the precision the journal specified. It had taken 2 full days. Owen Mercer destroyed it in 8 minutes. He came in darkness. Ida and Helen were asleep inside the partially sealed cave, the entrance still lacking its final wall. Owen moved with the particular unsteadiness of a person navigating not just bad footing, but something happening inside him that his legs had not been consulted about. He stood over the chimney stack, and through the thin leather of his boot soles, even through the whiskey, he could feel the warmth rising from the earth beneath his feet. Stored heat from 35 feet of stone-lined flue below, radiating upward through packed earth as gently as breath. The system was working. Even incomplete, even untested at full capacity, the fundamental principle was demonstrating itself to anyone standing in the right spot with enough attention left to feel it. He kicked the stack once testing, twice harder. The third time was something else entirely, an act that had no relationship to logic or strategy, that came from the place in a person where unexamined pain lives, the place that has been told its whole life that usefulness is the price of visibility. The stones scattered, the clay joints cracked. 2 days of work collapsed into rubble in the dark. He sat on a rock near what he'd done and waited for the relief that should have followed. It didn't come. What came instead was a hollowness so complete it had its own texture, the specific emptiness that follows an act committed not from strength, but from the absence of it. He sat there for a long time. The whiskey bottle ended up broken somewhere nearby. When he finally left, his boot prints pressed deep into the soft earth beside the rubble, the distinctive tread of a specific pair of boots sold from a specific inventory. Ida found the destruction in the earliest light. She stood before it for a moment that stretched. Her body was very still, the stillness of something about to break, or something choosing not to. Her hands shook with something that had nothing to do with the temperature. She looked at the boot prints in the soft earth beside the rubble. She looked at the broken glass, the whiskey bottle's label partially legible. She understood what she was looking at. She was not certain. There was a difference between those two things that would matter later. Helen appeared at this cave entrance, saw the rubble, saw her daughter's face. She asked who had done it, not with anger, but with the practical urgency of someone who wants to know what kind of problem they're dealing with. Ida picked up the pickaxe and began clearing the debris. That afternoon, she walked into town. The bell above the Mercer General Store announced her arrival, and when Owen looked up from the nail bins and saw her standing in the doorway, something passed across his face. Not guilt in its simple form, but the more complex expression of a person bracing for a specific kind of impact they believe they have earned. "I need wire and hinges." Her voice was level. Her face disclosed nothing. "I'll pay with labor. 1 day in your stockroom." Owen blinked. He had prepared himself for accusation. He had not prepared himself for commerce. "I thought you didn't need anyone." "I don't need charity. I'm buying supplies." She worked his stockroom the following day for 8 hours, organizing inventory with the same systematic precision she brought to everything, while Owen found himself unable to stop watching from behind the counter. He had imagined many versions of how this encounter might go. He had not imagined this version, the one where she treated him with the polite, business-like neutrality one extends to a stranger whose feelings are beside the point. The absence of anger was worse than anger would have been. It communicated clearly that she had seen what he'd done, understood what had driven him to do it, concluded that he did not merit the energy of her contempt. She left without reference to the chimney stack. She didn't look back from the doorway. She rebuilt the stack in 2 days. This time the stones went into a trench below grade set in clay at a depth no casual boot could reach. She laid heavy flat rocks across the top as a second layer, each one requiring both hands to lift into position. When it was done, she pressed both palms against the surface and felt nothing move. She was not just building now. She was building against the knowledge that the world contained people who would unmake her work if given the opportunity, which meant the work had to become unmakeable. The crisis arrived on the morning of November 2nd, 12 days before Helen's deadline. Her pickaxe broke through a layer of compacted gravel near the chimney connection, and water began seeping in. Not a rush, nothing dramatic in the first moments. Just a slow, consistent upwelling from below, as if the earth had been waiting patiently for exactly this moment to reveal what it had been holding in reserve. She watched the water level rise. Within an hour, 2 inches stood in the bottom of the trench. She crouched and observed with the careful attention her father had taught her, not reacting but trying to understand a system. Water in the flue meant steam when hot gases passed through. Steam meant heat dissipating into humidity rather than transferring into stone. The thermal system, all 38 feet of it, already completed, would fail to function. Not partially. entirely, because the fundamental mechanism of conductive heat transfer through solid material required that the material remain dry. She had accounted for compacted earth. She had accounted for embedded granite. She had not accounted for a hidden seam of groundwater sitting below the gravel layer precisely where the final section of flue needed to run. She sat in the trench with her legs in the cold water, her wrists on her knees, and for the first time since the plan had arrived fully formed in the cave weeks ago, the architecture of her determination developed a crack. Not a collapse, a crack. The kind that doesn't announce structural failure, but raises the question of it. Helen was watching from above. She had seen her daughter's back through every variety of difficulty these past weeks. The back of exertion, the back of fury after the sabotage, the back of exhaustion on nights when the work ran past moonrise. She had never seen the back Ida was showing now, the back of a person who has run out of the thing they have been running on. Ida opened the journal. She turned to the damaged page near the back, the one where moisture had fallen on the ink at some point, blurring the text into a wash of gray she had never been able to fully read. She tilted the journal at an angle, positioning it so the thin afternoon light coming through the cave entrance struck the surface at a shallow rake, the way light reveals topography by catching the edges of small elevations. The letters emerged from the blurred ink like shapes rising from fog. Grade the floor at 2 degrees. Water follows gravity, not hope. Let the earth do the thinking. She read it twice. The number sat in her chest like a struck bell. 2 degrees, the chalk mark on the rock outside the cave entrance. On the day they arrived, the arrow pointing inward, that number left by whoever had also left the tools, whoever had known enough about this specific geological location to anticipate this specific problem before she'd broken ground. Someone had tried to warn her before it happened. She hadn't had the context to understand what she was being warned about. The solution was simple in the way that the best engineering solutions are simple, not because they require little effort, but because they align with what the physical world is already doing rather than fighting it. A 2-degree slope in the floor of the trench, running from the firebox toward the chimney end, would guide any infiltrating groundwater downhill out through a narrow drainage channel cut along one side. Gravity would do what no mechanical intervention could sustain over a winter. The difficulty was that implementing the fix required opening every sealed section she'd already completed, adjusting the floor grade of the entire trench, relaying every stone, resealing every joint. Every foot of work she'd already done had to be done again better. She spent the next 2 days in a state of labor that had moved past exhaustion into something that felt paradoxically like clarity. Each section she reopened was a conversation with her past self, correcting errors she couldn't have known to avoid. By the afternoon of the second day, when she made the final cut in the drainage channel and watched the accumulated groundwater begin to move slowly at first, then with the quiet conviction of something obeying a law rather than making a choice, she set down the shovel and walked out of the cave. She sat on the cold ground outside the entrance. The light was failing in the west, going the colors of bruised copper. She could feel the trench water running away beneath her, following the grade her father had calculated, solving with geometry what she had tried to solve with effort alone. The tears came without announcement. Not from sadness, she was past sadness, the way you get past a country you've been traveling through too long. They came from somewhere deeper and less legible, from the place where the body keeps track of what the mind refuses to count. Weeks of it. The weight of the deadline, the sabotage, the groundwater, the cold that never relented, the cough she heard through her sleep, the specific loneliness of doing something no one around you believes is possible. "I'm so tired, Pa." The words came out smaller than she intended, addressed to the failing light to the cold ground. Helen came out without being called. She moved slowly across the rock, lowered herself to the ground, with the careful economy of someone whose body has learned caution, put her arm around Ida's shoulders. She didn't speak immediately. She was a woman who had learned the difference between silence that abandons and silence that stays. After a while into the quiet, "He used to cry too, every evening after his shift. He thought I didn't know. He'd go to the back step and put his face in his hands, and I'd hear him through the kitchen window." A pause. Every morning he went back into that mine. Ida said nothing. She needed only to know that the man whose calculations she was staking her mother's life on had also known what it felt like to come to the end of his strength and get up anyway. That the journal was not written from a position of effortless mastery, but from the same grinding daily choice she was making. The physics was inherited. The stubbornness was too. The first star appeared in the strip of sky visible above the ridgeline. She looked at it for a moment, then stood up, went inside, returned to work. The cave was sealed on the 4th of November, 13 days before Helen's deadline. The wall across the entrance was built from Frank Aldrich's Douglas fir, supplemented by salvage planks from an abandoned storage shed in the next valley that Ida had disassembled and carried up the slope board by board over 3 trips. She framed the opening with care, leaving space for a door built from double planks and a single window she would glaze with a piece of glass. She traded Helen's silver brooch for completing the transaction without mentioning it to her mother until the glass was already set in its frame and the trade was irreversible. Helen looked at the window for a long moment. Her expression was not what Ida had braced for. "He gave me that brooch the year before you were born," she said. "Then he would have approved." Bess Aldrich returned once more, this time with her daughter Lucy in tow. Lucy was 7 years old and possessed the brutal directness of children who have not yet learned that honesty requires social permission. She watched Ida pressing moss into the gaps between the planks and asked without preamble, "Do you live in a cave like a bear?" The laugh came from Ida before she could decide whether to allow it, surprised out of her belonging to a version of herself that had existed before the past 6 weeks had compressed her into someone more strictly functional. "Warmer than a bear," she said. Bess worked beside her for 2 hours with quick, competent hands. Before she left, she offered something with the quality of information passed carefully across a fence. "Thomas is troubled by something he won't name. He lies awake. I think you worried him more than he wants to admit." After they left, the silence of the hillside settled back. Ida built the first fire on the 4th of November, a small one, a handful of dried juniper branches placed in the stone firebox with the care of someone lighting something that has waited a long time to be lit. The match caught. The kindling took. The smoke vanished into the earth, drawn inward and downward through 40 feet of stone-lined passage, silent as a held breath, the system accepting its first real test without ceremony. Not a wisp entered the room. For 3 hours, nothing else happened. The fire burned. The air in the cave remained cold. Ida fed the firebox with measured additions at precise intervals, waiting in the specific silence of a person who has bet everything on a principle they have never been able to fully test. Helen sat wrapped in her quilts. The cough came and went. Outside, the temperature had dropped past the point where breath was visible in daylight. Ida lay on her bedroll, well past dark, listening to her mother's breathing. Then she felt it not in the air, but through the bedroll, through the stone beneath it. A warmth so faint it could have been wishful thinking. She pressed her palm flat against the cave floor, moved it 6 inches along the buried path of the flue. The warmth was stronger there. Another 6 inches stronger still. 40 feet of sandstone and shale charged by the passage of hot gases, radiating that charge upward through the packed earth, the thermal battery her father had designed, accepting its first full load, beginning slowly to pay it out. She looked at her mother. Helen was asleep. Her breathing was steady in its rhythm, clear in its quality, the kind of breathing a body produces when it is not fighting for air, but simply using it. No cough. For the first time in months, no cough accompanied the act of sleeping. Ida lay with her palm flat on the warm floor and felt a relief so complete, it bypassed every category she had for ordinary feelings, arriving instead at something that lived near grief. The specific emotion of a person who has been braced for failure so long that the arrival of success feels for a moment indistinguishable from loss. Then it sorted itself into what it actually was. She closed her eyes for the first time since October, sleeping without the unfinished things sitting on her chest. Outside to the northwest, the sky had been building something for 2 days high. Thin clouds stacking above the peaks in the particular formation that people who live in exposed country learn to read the way sailors read swells. Whatever was coming would have to get through 40 feet of stone first. The warm day arrived on January 11th like a confidence man. Generous, persuasive offering, exactly what everyone wanted to believe. By noon, the temperature had climbed to 43 degrees. Children in Harrow Falls shed their coats in the street. Men stood in doorways with their faces turned up to the pale winter sun, talking about the Chinook wind coming off the western slopes, talking about early spring, talking with the easy certainty of people who have survived enough winters to believe they can read them. Women opened windows that had been sealed since October, releasing the accumulated indoor air of months. Ida stepped out of the cave and stood on the ledge above the valley, and the warmth felt wrong. Too generous. Too sudden. The sky was the particular shade of blue that looks polished rather than natural, the kind of blue that has no depth behind it. She breathed in and identified what she'd been half aware of since waking, a metallic edge in the air, faint but unmistakable. The scent of barometric pressure, dropping faster than weather should drop it. Her father had written about this in his mine safety notes. When the pressure falls quickly, the air tries to equalize itself, which is another way of saying the world is preparing to become something else entirely. She went back inside, checked the wood supply, 2 weeks of fuel stacked against the far wall, built past what seemed necessary, because something in her had insisted on it. Checked every joint in the cave wall, pressing her fingers into the moss-packed gaps, feeling for any give. Checked the chimney draw by holding a lit splinter near the firebox opening and watching the flame angle inward with steady conviction. She ran her hands along the buried flue stones, reading them through the packed earth the way her father had read rock faces, looking for any change in temperature that might indicate a crack in the seal. Everything held. She fed the fire, sat down. Outside, for the first time in weeks, the wind had gone completely still. The blizzard of January 12th began at 1:15 in the afternoon, a timing that history would remember as a specific cruelty calculated to catch the maximum number of people outside coatless in the middle of ordinary tasks. The temperature had been 43 degrees. Within 5 minutes of the storm's arrival, it was 23. Within 30 minutes, it was below zero and still falling. As if zero were merely a landmark, the cold was passing through on its way to somewhere more serious. The wall of darkness that came from the northwest had no precedent in most people's experience. It was not a cloud formation. It was a discontinuity, a hard edge between the world as it had been and the world as it was about to be, moving across the valley at locomotive speed. The wind arrived before the snow did, which gave it the quality of a warning no one had time to act on. It hit the buildings of Harrow Falls as a physical force, not a pressure. Several men were knocked from their feet. A shutter tore from the front of the general store with a sound like a gunshot. Then the snow came, and there was no longer any meaningful distinction between ground and sky. In Frank Aldrich's home, the finest built cabin in the valley, constructed with 30 years of craft and the best materials available in Dakota Territory, the storm found every weakness that skill alone cannot eliminate. Wind at that velocity doesn't respect craftsmanship. It finds the physics of a building and exploits it. The slight gap where two log courses meet, the joint around a window frame where the chinking has compressed over 3 winters. Through each of these, the storm inserted itself, and with it came the fine horizontal snow that settled on surfaces like powder, accumulating on the furniture, on the floor, on the backs of hands. Frank fed the fireplace 3 logs at a time. The fire roared with a theatrical vigor of something burning everything it had, and 10 feet from its opening, the temperature was below freezing. The stone fireplace, his masterwork, the thing he had built in this room before he built anything else, was consuming his winter fuel supply at a rate he could calculate too precisely. He counted what remained. He did the arithmetic. The arithmetic said morning possibly, if the fire burned as hot as it was burning now. After morning, the furniture. After the furniture, the floor planks. Will Aldrich lay on the cot nearest the fireplace, wrapped in everything the house contained that could wrap. He was 6 years old and had woken that morning with the fever that children get, unremarkable under normal circumstances, a few days of broth and rest, and the body does what bodies are built to do. Under these circumstances, the fever had become something with a different character entirely. His breathing was shallow and rapid, the sound of a respiratory system working harder than it should. Bess pressed a cloth to his forehead with hands that had gone rigid from controlled fear. Not the fear that screams, but the fear that goes very quiet and very focused and does not look away. Frank stood at the woodpile and counted again, as if the count might change. Then he looked at his wife. Bess was watching him with an expression he had not seen in 20 years of marriage. Not accusation, not blame, but the quiet, unbearable clarity of a woman who has done the arithmetic too, who understands what her husband's hands built and what they failed to build, who is too frightened to do anything but look at him with that understanding plainly in her face. He had come to that hillside with Douglas fir. He had told Ida Voss she was building a death trap. He had walked away in the posture of a man who has discharged his duty to the reckless. The fire ate another log and gave back a fraction of what it consumed. In the Mercer General Store, Owen fed wooden crates into the pot-bellied stove while his father sat in the chair by the counter and coughed. The elder Mercer's cough had been developing for weeks, a deep, wet sound that originated not in the throat, but in the chest, in the tissue, the sound of something that had been ignored long enough to establish itself. Owen heard it and went still inside the way he'd gone still at 9 years old, standing in the doorway of his mother's room, listening to the same sound from a different chest. He fed another crate into the stove. The heat it produced lasted perhaps 4 minutes before the cold absorbed it entirely. He thought about the warmth he had felt through his boot soles on the night he stood over the chimney stack, the warmth rising from 35 feet of buried fluestone, gentle, steady, indifferent to his presence, requiring nothing from him, owing him nothing, simply existing according to the laws that govern heat and stone. He had felt it even through the whiskey, even through everything he'd brought up that hill with him. The system worked. He had known that standing in the dark with the broken bottle at his feet. He had known it, and he had tried to destroy it anyway. The stove popped. His father coughed again, longer this time. Inside the cold mouth, the storm arrived as sound. A low, sustained roar that had the character of weather not as a temporary condition, but as a new, permanent state of the world. Through the sealed wall, it was muffled, reduced to atmospheric pressure rather than specific noise. The candle on the table burned straight. The air held still in the way of air that has been protected by more than walls, protected by mass, by the thermal physics of rock that has been accumulating warmth for weeks and is now releasing it with the patience of something that doesn't experience urgency. Helen sat across the table with her knitting needles moving at their steady rhythm. The yarn was Bess's wool worked now into a shape beginning to resemble a garment. She had not coughed since morning. "It sounds angry out there." "It is." Ida placed 3 small branches in the firebox. The stone accepted them without complaint. Helen set down her needles. "Are you worried?" Ida held the question up against what she knew. The floor warm beneath her feet, the wall at her back unmoved, the fuel supply calculated past any storm of normal duration. She thought about the word worried, what it would require from her if she let it in. No. The word came out without the effortful quality of reassurance, which was how she knew it was true. The blizzard lasted 3 days. Within the cold mouth, those days took on a texture distinct from ordinary time, not suspended exactly, but relocated. The storm outside had removed the usual coordinates by which a person knows where they are in relation to the world, and without those coordinates, the small interior sounds of living acquired unusual weight. The click of Helen's needles, the particular way certain coals collapsed in the firebox. The thin, regular dripping of snowmelt finding its way through a hairline crack near the ceiling, which Ida caught in a tin cup she'd positioned by the end of the second day. On the second night, when the wind had settled into its long-sustained roar and the darkness outside the small window was absolute, Helen told stories about Edward that she hadn't told before. Not the heroic versions, the actual ones. The time he'd miscalculated a timber support and spent a full shift fixing his own error, while the other men worked around him without comment, because in a mine you don't discuss a man's mistakes while he's correcting them. The way he'd been frightened of horses his entire life but never told anyone, because miners weren't supposed to be frightened of horses. The arguments about money, about staying in Harrow Falls, versus moving on about whether the copper mine would last another decade. Then she told what she had not told before. He knew his lungs were going. Her voice had the quality of something that has been carried in a closed space for a long time and is finally being given air. The mine dust. He could feel it before I could hear it. He came to me one night, this was 4 years before the accident, maybe a little more, and he said he'd been thinking about a house. Not a cabin, something different. He said he'd found a hillside north of town with a cave in it, and the rock was the right kind, and he thought a person could live inside it through a winter if they built it correctly. He had drawings. Ida set down the journal she'd been holding. I didn't understand the drawings. Helen looked at her hands in her lap. But I understood the expression on his face when he showed them to me. It was the same expression he had the night you were born, when they put you in his hands for the first time, and he just looked at you. Not smiling exactly, more like he was looking at something he'd been trying to calculate for years and had finally seen the answer to. She looked up. He wasn't building a house, Ida. He was building a promise. The mind took him before he could keep it. The fire crackled. The storm consumed itself against the indifferent mountain. But you kept it, Helen said. You built what he couldn't finish. You kept his promise. Ida looked at the journal on the table, the leather cover worn at the corners, the pages dense with her father's precise handwriting, the diagrams that had guided every decision of the past 6 weeks. She had read those pages as a technical document extracted from them. Specifications and measurements and material requirements followed the instructions the way you follow a blueprint. But sitting in the warm cave the blueprint had produced, hearing her mother name what the document actually was, she understood for the first time what she had been holding. Every calculation about thermal mass, every note about drainage angles, every specification for stone selection had been written by a man who knew he was losing time, who was trying to compress into ink everything his family would need after he was gone. The physics was the language. The message beneath it was something that predated every scientific principle it described. Something as old as the first person who built a fire for someone they loved. She reached across the table. Helen took her hand without speaking. On the morning of the 15th, the storm broke. Ida woke before Helen, before the light had fully arrived. She dressed in the dark, fed the firebox quietly so as not to wake her mother, stood at the door for a moment with her hand on the latch. She stepped outside alone. The world had been remade. The temperature stood somewhere far below zero, under a sky so clear and cold, it looked like polished steel. The valley below the scarp was buried the familiar geography of Harrow Falls, visible only as geometric suggestions under drifts, 10 feet deep rooftops emerging like afterthoughts from the white. The silence that followed the storm's end was the silence of a world scoured clean of sound. Nothing moved. Nothing breathed that she could see or hear. She turned and looked at the chimney stack, still standing, a thread of warmth rising into the frozen air above it, barely visible against the blue. Almost nothing, the ghost of heat that had traveled 40 feet underground before arriving at this exit point. She watched it for a long moment. Then she placed her right hand against the outer face of the cave wall. Stone. Cold as stone is cold in January, as stone has always been cold in the open air of a Dakota winter. She placed her left hand against the inner face of the same wall. Warm. Not dramatically, not the warmth of a fire or a body. The deep structural warmth of material that has been holding heat for weeks and intends to keep holding it. Her father's warmth, in a sense stored in the rock he had chosen by the system he had designed, delivered now through her hands into the wall of the home she had built from his unfinished sentence. She stood with both palms against the wall, cold on one side, warm on the other, and understood something that had no name and required none. This would stand after her. It would stand after everyone who currently knew her name had stopped knowing anything at all. Her father had tried to build permanence out of the time he had left. She had finished the attempt. Whatever came next, this was already done and could not be undone. She didn't cry. She simply stood, both hands on the wall, until the cold on her right palm and the warmth on her left palm were equally real, equally present, equally hers. Then she went inside to tend the fire. The town meeting that morning covered plans that were too late for the crisis already at hand. Holt talked about organizing a logging party. The men in the room did the arithmetic about the snow depth. The arithmetic one as arithmetic tends to. Frank Aldrich stood up because he couldn't think of anything else to do. There's one place that may still be warm. He hadn't needed to say where. Every man in the room knew where. Several of them had used the words Voss Folly in the past 3 months, and a few of those men were looking at the floor now, rather than at Frank. Clem Dacre rose from the back corner of the room. The movement slow, geological, preceded by nothing that could have predicted it. He had not spoken at a town meeting in years. He occupied the category of town fixture, present, unremarkable, neither consulted nor excluded, simply there. The girl is alive. Edward Voss understood how to live inside stone. His daughter understands it too. I've seen what she built. He looked around the room at the frozen faces, the desperate faces, the faces of men who had mocked a 17-year-old girl onto a hillside and were now being asked to go to her for rescue. I'm going. Aldrich, are you coming? Frank was already moving. The journey was 2 miles through snow that in places reached their chests. Frank was stronger, younger, propelled by a father's specific fuel, the image of Will's pale face, the shallow breathing, the arithmetic about the woodpile. Clem moved with the deliberate mechanical patience of a man who has spent decades doing difficult things in places where panic is the most dangerous option available. Frank fell the second time on a section of trail that had drifted particularly deep, and when he went down, his legs did not respond to the instruction to get up. The cold had been working on him for over an hour and had been thorough. He lay in the drift, and the whiteness around him had a quality he recognized with the part of his brain that stays rational, even when everything else is failing the quality of comfort. It would be easy to stay here. Clem's hand closed around his collar. The grip was not the grip a man his age should have been capable of. Get up, not yet. The words were not gentle. They were a command issued by someone who has given this command before in darker places and has been obeyed. Frank got up. They crested the final rise, and Frank saw the chimney stack first barely visible above the snow line. A small stone column that should have been buried but wasn't because Ida had built it tall enough. Above the stack, that thread of warmth rising into the frozen air. Through the small window of the sealed cave entrance, light, steady, warm amber, the light of a controlled interior that has been burning through 3 days of storm without faltering. He raised his hand and knocked. The door opened inward. The warmth that came through the opening was not a blast. He had been expecting a blast, the aggressive exhalation of a space overheated against the cold outside. What came instead was an embrace warmth from every direction, simultaneously from the floor beneath his feet, from the walls on either side, from the air itself, which had a quality of saturation. Not hot air, thoroughly warm. Warm the way the inside of a living thing is warm, because it came from within the structure rather than from a source at one end of it. Ida stood in the doorway wearing a wool dress, no coat, no shawl. She looked at Frank with an expression that held none of the things he'd been bracing himself to find: no triumph, no vindication, carefully suppressed, no satisfaction at being owed an acknowledgement. She looked at him the way you look at a person who is suffering and whose suffering you understand. He stepped inside. He turned slowly. Then he pulled off his gloves, raised his right hand, pressed his palm flat against the cave wall. The raw rock uninsulated the surface that in any conventional understanding should have been the coldest point in the room. It was warm. Not dramatically, not unnaturally. Warm with the specific quality of something that has been warm for a long time and intends to remain warm, a deep structural warmth that didn't come from a source you could point to, but from the material itself. From 35 feet of stone that had been accepting heat for weeks and had reached the equilibrium his experience told him was theoretically possible, and his pride had told him was practically irrelevant. He kept his palm there. The understanding that moved through him was not the fast understanding of intellectual argument, but the slow understanding of physical evidence, the kind that doesn't engage with your opinions about it, that simply is the way temperature simply is, the way stone simply is. He had spent 30 years building structures that worked against the winter by burning more fuel than the winter could steal. He had believed this was the best available answer because it was the only answer he had been taught to give. He had not been wrong exactly. He had been limited. There was a difference, and standing in this room with his palm against this wall, he felt that difference in a way no argument could have produced. Clem had found his corner. He sat on the warm floor with his back against the wall, eyes closed, face carrying the expression of a man who has arrived somewhere he intended to arrive and is allowing himself to feel the fact of it. He murmured something too low for Frank to hear, addressed to the air, to the stone, to whoever was listening. Frank didn't ask what it was. "My boy is sick. We have no more wood." The words came out in fragments because the full sentence required a kind of admission his body was resisting, even as his mouth made it. Ida looked at this man long enough to be deliberate, short enough to be a mercy. "Then bring your family here. There's room and it's warm. She loaded the small sled from her woodpile enough to heat the Aldrich cabin to survivable temperature for the journey, not a gift she could easily spare. Frank took the rope. At the door with his back to her, he paused for a moment, then walked into the white without turning around. The sled's runners made a clean sound on the packed snow, moving away, growing fainter. That was all. That was enough. The Aldrich family arrived that evening. Helen was at the cot before Bess had fully entered the cave, moving with a speed and certainty Ida hadn't seen from her mother in months, the celerity of a woman who has identified something she knows how to do. She laid Will down, placed her hand on his forehead, assessed what she found there with the calm of someone who understands that medicine is mostly persistence. She wrung cloths in water heated on the firebox, laid them on Will's chest, replacing them as they cooled, working with the steady repetition of a woman who knows the right thing and keeps doing it past the point where it seems to be helping until it does. She sang while she worked the simple Pennsylvania melody, worn smooth by the passing of many hands, the song with no origin story that simply exists because enough people needed it. Will stopped moving against the cot. His breathing slowed. His hand came up and found the edge of the warm cloth on his chest. Bess sat across from Helen and watched. At some point during the long middle of the night, she extended one hand across the cot and laid it over Helen's. Helen didn't stop what she was doing. She held Bess's hand, continued her work, continued her song. Two women looked at each other in the warm cave above the sleeping child, and whatever passed between them in that look required none of the words that neither of them had quite enough of. They were mothers. That was vocabulary enough. Owen Mercer arrived on the third day. He came without announcement, without the performance of casualness that had always been his default presentation. The man who stepped through the door bore the same name as the man who had leaned against the porch post 3 months ago, but the resemblance ended there, thinner, through the face eyes moving in small uncertain arcs. A rawness about him that had nothing to do with the cold, and everything to do with what 3 days alone with a sick father and a dying stove had clarified. The room went quiet in the way of rooms where people know something the newcomer doesn't know they know. Ida looked at him. Not the face, what the face was covering. She saw the 9-year-old boy at his mother's doorway. She saw the chimney stones scattered in the dark. She held both things at once, the harm he had done and the harm being done to him, and felt in herself the resistance she hadn't acknowledged until now, the part that wanted to use the door as the instrument it could be. She let the resistance exist. She looked at it without flinching. Then she made the choice that costs more than anger, because anger is at least a form of energy. Is your father all right? Something moved across Owen's face. Not relief exactly, but the particular expression of a person who has been braced for impact and feels the ground hold. I don't know, I have to go back in the morning. I'll give you wood for the trip. He sat down heavily against the wall. What collapsed was not his body, but something structural in the architecture of how he presented himself to the world, some load-bearing element under stress for too long. The tears came without sound, which meant they had been accumulating behind a very controlled surface for a very long time. Bess Aldrich from across the cave looked at his boots, the specific tread pattern she had seen once before, pressed into soft earth beside a pile of chimney rubble on an early morning she had not mentioned to anyone. She looked at Ida. Ida shook her head once, minimal, absolute. Bess looked back at Owen. Some reckonings don't happen in words. They happen in the slow, unglamorous work of becoming a different person than you were. Owen left before dawn. The journey to his father's store and back took 4 hours through snow that had compacted enough to be navigable, but not enough to be easy. He fell twice. The second time he stayed down long enough to become aware of the choice he was making by getting back up. Not a heroic choice, not a dramatic one, simply the choice to continue in the absence of any reason, compelling enough to justify stopping. He carried his father up the hill on the sled. The old man bundled in everything the store contained, arrived at the cave door with blood in his gloves, and nothing left of himself that wasn't being spent on the last few yards. He did not ask for acknowledgement. He found a space along the wall, sat down, looked at his hands with the expression of someone examining evidence of something they're not yet sure how to name. 2 more families arrived over the next 2 days, guided by Frank, making the journey 3 times, widening the path slightly with each crossing. The cave that had been built for 2 now held 14 people. Crowded, uncomfortable life at full requirements, stripped of everything not directly related to continuing, but warm with a steady, sourceless warmth that no longer surprised anyone inside it, that came from everywhere at once, because it came from the structure itself. Judge Cyrus Holt came to the Coldmouth in March on foot, carrying his hat. He placed a document on the table without ceremony. 10 additional acres surrounding the scarp, deeded free and clear, with a notation in the margin in his own handwriting, with the gratitude of the board. He did not stay. He did not offer the word apology, because some men are not built with access to that particular vocabulary. And Ida had known that about him from the moment he'd called her mother by her first name in that room full of witnesses. She accepted the deed with the same silence with which she had accepted the original one, receiving it as information rather than as judgment on the past. The unmarked crates began appearing at the cave entrance in the spring wire hinges. Nails, good quality mortar materials from the Mercer store inventory, delivered without invoice or explanation. Ida used everything without comment. The crates kept coming, irregular in timing, but consistent in content for 2 full seasons. She never mentioned them to Owen. He never mentioned them to her. They had developed without any explicit negotiation, a fluency in the dialect of things understood but not spoken. Frank Aldrich returned to the Coldmouth one evening in June, when the snow was gone from everything except the highest ridgelines. He sat at the small table across from Ida, and they shared the particular silence of 2 people who have been through something together that they have not yet discussed and are deciding whether to discuss it now. Why didn't you make me understand? No accusation, a genuine inquiry from a craftsman trying to identify where in the process the error occurred. When I came with the lumber, why didn't you force me to see it? Ida considered the question with the care it deserved. Because I didn't know how to trust anyone. I only knew how to trust stone. Frank was quiet for a moment. I only knew how to trust wood. They looked at each other across the table. Frank picked up a spent match and used it to draw on the frost of the window pane, a frame solid and properly joined with a horizontal system beneath the floor, running toward a distant chimney. His craft integrated with her physics. Ida changed the angle of the flue path with a small movement of her finger on the glass. Frank adjusted one line based on a slight inclination of her head. Neither of them named what they were building. They both looked at the drawing on the cold glass, 2 kinds of knowledge making the thing that emerges when they stop competing. Clem Dacre died on a Tuesday afternoon in the autumn of 1890, sitting in his corner of the cave with a cup of tea cooling in his hands. Helen found him. He looked peaceful, which was accurate, and like he was sleeping, which was also accurate. Ida buried him on the hillside above the cave entrance and set a piece of red sandstone at the head of the grave, large, flat, unmistakable. She didn't carve his name into it. The stone was enough. He would have understood that better than any inscription. She had known by then what he had carried. The previous autumn, a year before his death, when the cave was warm with its second winter's fire, and the world outside had gone orange and quiet. He had reached into his coat pocket and placed a stone on the table beside her cup without preamble. Red sandstone threaded with dark shale, small enough to close a hand around, worn smooth, in the particular way that only human contact wears stone. Not the smoothness of waterwork or windwork, but the smoothness of a thumb returning to the same surface 10,000 times, the unconscious fidget of a man working something in his pocket the way other men work a coin. He gave it to me the week before the shaft collapsed. Clem had said, his voice rough with the effort of words that had been waiting a long time for their occasion. Said to hold on to it. Said it was the future. I didn't understand what he meant. His eyes had moved to Ida's face. I understand now. He had told her then about the chalk mark, the tools, the nights of digging. Edward had talked to him about the hillside more than once, had worked through the groundwater problem on paper, arrived at the 2-degree solution, shared it with the one man he trusted to understand the geology. Clem had not told her straight out because it wasn't his to tell straight out. If I'd handed you the solution, he had said, you'd have built his cave. He had looked around at the walls, the door with its tight-fitted frame, the floor warm underfoot. This is yours. He gave you the knowledge. You made the thing. Ida had held the stone warm from his pocket, growing warmer from her hand holding that warmth for a measurable time after she set it down, which was the central property of the material and had been the foundation of everything she'd built. She had closed her fingers around it and said nothing because the stone had already said what needed saying. She kept it after he was gone. She kept it for the rest of her life. Helen outlived every forecast Sutton had made, which she seemed to regard as a mild form of personal victory. The warm, clean air of the cave gave her lungs the one thing they had been prescribed, and never in the cabin in town been provided consistency. Year after year, the warmth held. Year after year, the cough diminished. She died at 78 in the spring of a year when the wildflowers on the terrace garden outside were just coming in. In the bed Ida had built for her against the warmest section of the cave floor. Her last words were not words, only the opening notes of the Pennsylvania melody hummed into the warm, still air, and then she was gone. The Voss hearth spread through the territory, the way useful things spread, not through announcement, but through people arriving at Harrow Falls expecting one kind of town and finding another. Homes built into hillsides half buried in the stable temperature of the earth, heated by long horizontal flues that ran beneath stone floors and surrendered their warmth to the building's bones before releasing spent air through distant chimneys. Frank Aldrich's carpentry and their joints square solid, correctly fitted. Ida Voss's thermal design and their orientation built toward the earth rather than against it. People who slept on warm stone floors in February called it extraordinary. Frank, when asked, described it as what happens when two people who understand different things about the same problem finally stop trying to convert each other. Years later, a traveler passing through Harrow Falls stopped at the general store. The man behind the counter was lean and careful, with watchful eyes that had learned to look at things longer before drawing conclusions. Owen Mercer, approaching 40, had become someone his 20-year-old self would not have recognized, arrived at through the same method most people arrive at, becoming better slowly, with considerable difficulty, without any single dramatic moment of transformation. The traveler asked about the houses built into the hillsides. Owen directed him to the town records. In the records, the traveler found a journal, leather-bound, the cover worn smooth at the corners, the pages filled from margin to margin with precise, angular handwriting, interspersed with technical diagrams. Edward Voss, the notation read, minor, amateur geologist. He had been neither amateur nor simply a minor, but the categories available in 1887 Dakota Territory had not had room for what he actually was. The final page held a single sentence, unaddressed, undated, written in the same careful hand as everything that preceded it, but in ink that had dried with a slightly different pressure. The pressure of a man writing the most important thing he has written and wanting the letters to hold. The tree fights the wind and breaks. The mountain holds the sun and remembers. Be the mountain. The traveler closed the journal. He sat for a long moment in the warm building, feeling through the soles of his boots the gentle, consistent heat rising from the stone floor, thinking about the kind of man who could find in the physics of heat transfer a statement about how to live, who could love his family so completely that the love survived him in the form of engineering. He stood. He walked outside into the clear Dakota air. On the hillside to the north, above the clustered rooftops of Harrow Falls, a thin wisp of warmth rose from a small stone column, barely visible against the slope, the chimney stack still performing its patient function at the far end of 40 feet of buried stone. In the window of the door set into the rock, a warm light glowed with the quality of something that has been tended for a long time and expects to continue. Inside, a hand moved across the glass of that window, unhurried, the way you touch something you have built and trust and intend to keep. The mountain remembered.